Next we're going to create some trunks for some more colorful deciduous trees. To make these trunks, we could use a palette knife and change the rotation, the angle, so it pointed down as we drew down. But Bob uses his palette knife and he uses an interesting mix of Van Dyke brown and white to get a splotchiness you see from the lichen in deciduous trunks. And in the brush engine, there's a neat way we can replicate this effect. So let's create a deciduous trunk brush. It seems like a bit of overkill, but I love creating these brushes. To start, we're going to use one of the DVAD brushes, the large rake. So let's go down to our brush presets and clear the filter, and I'm just going to type in rake, and we'll see if that pops up. I want the large, right there, rake large. We've used that as a base before, and with that brush selected, we're going to go to the brush engine. Just make sure you got it. Okay, it's the DVAD rake large, and let's see what that does. Clearly, that is not going to make a trunk for us. So I'm going to rotate this tip 90 degrees from what it's doing. Under brush tip, we can use the same texture it has, except I'm going to change the rotation. I'm just going to type in 90 there. And now we have something like this. Okay. I've got Van Dyke brown selected. Now let's go to the Van Dyke brown, and we have a trunk. But what's the difference between this and the palette knife? Well, this actually has a texture to it. And let's zoom in. I'm going to again click out here, and I'm going to zoom in a bit so we can see what's going on with this brush a little better. I'm just going to use the default size. The size here in pixels is somehow related to the resolution of the texture here, so it's showing up quite big here, but this is actually what we want. So I'm just going to leave it with what the rake large started with. So we have this texture that's being drawn, which you can see there every time I click, and it just looks like a streak when I draw down with it. But we can take advantage of that texture even though we're just going to draw a streak when we go down, and we're going to do that by mixing two colors into the brush. We're going to mix the foreground and the background color. So I have my background color as white and my foreground color as Van Dyke brown. Remember, I can click out here. You can hit X to swap the two. So if you didn't have white as your background, I can just click the white, hit X to make it my background, and then hit Van Dyke brown. I've got my two colors. Now I'm not using them yet, I'm just drawing here. So to get this effect, in the pixel brush engine, we have this option for the source of our color. Source here has a whole bunch of different options as to where you get your color. And if I go into the mix, what that's going to do is it's going to cause a mix between the foreground and our background color. I'm going to turn that on, and right now, by default, as most of these are, it's based on pressure. So at low pressure, according to this graph, when I have low pressure, it should be my foreground color, which is brown, and when at high pressure, it should be my background color, which is white. Let's see if that happens. Okay, so low pressure and high pressure. Well, that seems backwards. I'm not sure what's going on here. I'm getting white at low pressure and I'm getting brown at high pressure. And it's not because of the opacity, because if you click on opacity, it's actually turned off. So there is no opacity based on pressure here. Let's go back to the mix, and I'm going to try that again. This time I'm going to add a gradient so it's easier to see. So at low pressure, see at low pressure it actually is drawing white. It's not just that it's invisible. And then at high pressure, it turns to brown, low pressure, white, high pressure, brown, low pressure, high pressure, low pressure, high pressure. Okay, so something's messed up here. That's backwards. That's fine. All I wanted to do is switch between the two so you can see how you can affect the color with different dynamics. We could mix the color based on speed. So at fast it'll be one color, and slow it'll be another color. Which would be really cool, except that doesn't seem to be working at all. It's just drawing in white now. Whoop. There we go. Maybe I just wasn't drawing fast enough. Okay, let's try that again. Oh yeah, there we go. So slow, white, fast, brown. With the gradient, fast, slow, white, fast. Oh yeah. Whew, you really have to go fast to get that. We can fix that by bringing this up a bit, so then we don't quite have to go as fast to get to the proper color. There we go. Okay, enough playing around. What do we actually want here? What we want is we actually want it to be random. So I'm going to go back, as we've done before, and I'm going to use this fuzzy option, this fuzzy dynamic, which means, again, every time it draws or paints the texture, it will be a random color. And you can see that starting to happen right there. Once it does the brown, another time it does the white, and then the brown. And of course, because if you remember, our texture is kind of a bunch of dots, we'll get a brown set, and then a white set, and a brown set, mixed up. Let's go back to the mix. Right now we're getting mostly brown, so I'm going to pull that dot out from our experimentation. A line is fine. Here's our gradient, and this is what our trunk will look like, something like this, which is kind of cool. It has that banding that tree trunks actually have. Again, this is a lot of overkill. Most of this is going to be covered up in leaves anyway, which we're going to draw on afterwards. It was just a neat way to show this effect where you can mix the foreground and background colors in a brush using all sorts of different dynamics. You know what? I just want to try one more time. Let's try distance, which means the longer I draw, if I click on distance, we can see here. So when I start drawing, it should be the foreground color, and I guess after I get to 30 pixels, it should switch to the background color. That's not very far, but let's just see what happens. Yeah, it seems to be doing that. Now 30 pixels isn't very far, so it's switching back and forth all the time. What happens if we change this to, like, I don't know, 1,000 pixels? So it's going to start out brown, and the longer I draw, it turns to white. And then once it gets to 1,000 pixels, it's going to switch back again. So that's why it does that hard transition. It goes to white, 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 and then bam, it's going to hit brown again once it starts back at the beginning. That's pretty neat. Time? How about time? So now it's going to be based on 3 seconds. So it's not how long I draw, but after 3 seconds, it's going to go white, and then it's going to, once it hits 3 seconds, it'll switch back and cycle through again. So, and brown 3 seconds later. We can make that longer. Now, if you wanted it to cycle smoothly, what we would do is we would create something like this, where the color would go to the foreground color. After half the time it would be the background color, then half the time it would be the foreground color again. Jump back here, but there won't be that discontinuous bump. And if you really wanted it smooth, you could try and figure out some sort of smooth wave type feature there. And now it should smoothly transition between brown and white based on the time that I draw, and not based on the distance. So if I go slow, it's still going to transition after, do a whole cycle after 3 seconds. You can see the options here are awesome, and they're pretty much endless. Let's get back to the brush we want. I want a fuzzy brush. I want a straight line between the foreground and the background color. Remember, you can drag, if you get a plus icon, you can drag the red node. We want them in the corners. If you have extra ones, you can just drag them right off the screen and they'll pull right off. So here's our trunk brush. If you want to save it, you can. What do we have here for an icon? That's okay. I'm actually just going to draw, maybe I'll draw some trunks on here just so I can see what's going on. There we go. And I'll call this our BR trunk. Save to presets. It's not here yet. We only have room for one more preset. That's actually something you can go in and you can change in the settings. Let's go to our presets, clear any filters. Let's search for BR again. And do we see our trunk brush? There it is right there, BR trunk. Right click, assign to tag Bob Ross. There it popped up our little trunk brush. Let's use it. Okay, let's create a new layer for our trunks. I'm not sure I actually covered the shortcut yet for inserting a new layer. We're kind of doing that lots, so we should probably start using it. It's just the insert key, which is usually up near the page up, page down home end on your keyboard. If I hit insert, I should get a new layer. Let's call this trunks. Or you could actually just make this your whole next layer of deciduous trees, depending on how much resolution you want on all these things. So I'm using that default size again, which is really small, but remember it's doing some sort of calculation based on the size of these patterns that we're using as the basis for our brush shape. So I'm going to draw a trunk here, something like that. Draw another one over here, and over here. Again, these are fairly bright. There's a lot of white in here. We can make them more brown. Let's do that. I'll show you how. We have our brush dynamic. Let's go up here into the engine. This is our BR truck brush. That was supposed to say trunk. And under fuzzy, let's take a look at what it looks like. Okay, it looks like that. There's a lot of white. We only want a little bit of white in here. We want it mostly brown. So brown is our foreground color, and we want more foreground. So I'm going to click and add a node and just bend it towards the foreground at the bottom. And let's see if that works. Looks like it had the opposite effect. We mentioned that before, where the foreground and background seems to be mixed up here. Either that or I'm mixed up about something. Let's just bend it that way. And now we should get mostly, yeah, now we're getting mostly brown with a little bit of highlights. Let's do a little bit more. There we go. That looks good. Just get whatever you like. I actually like that better. So I'm going to overwrite my preset. Let's load that back up again. I'm going to overwrite my preset and save the new one. Okay, let's try some trunks again. There we go. So I got a little carried away with this trunk brush. We're going to end this video here and finish off with one more. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you back for the last episode.